Okay, I want to get a little weird and talk about time and time travel. Obviously, through media, we have been conditioned to view the idea of time travel in a physical way. Someone steps into a phone booth or a DeLorean or some other device and it travels them physically through time so that their current version of themselves is transported from wherever they were currently at to a different point in the timeline. None of us know if this is actually possible, and I mean that in the sense of none of us know if it's even theoretically possible, not just, oh, it hasn't been invented yet, but it's possible. We don't even know if something like that, given the laws of physics in this reality, we don't even know if that is actually possible. So let's imagine a different form of time travel, which would be the development of some kind of device that would be able to eject your consciousness from your body and transport it into an earlier version of yourself. Or likewise, a future version of yourself if they somehow could know that your body actually existed in the time period that they wanted to send your consciousness to, right? Because if you died before the time that they sent you to, theoretically this would not be possible and create some kind of problem. That said, let's go with the idea of your consciousness being transported back into the past, of your own personal timeline. This would be something like, for example, my consciousness right now, knowing what I know, being transported back into my body when I was 16 years old. Imagine what I would be able to accomplish with the knowledge that I have now if I was able to apply it from the time that I was 16 years old. Obviously, my life would take on a whole different trajectory from that point in time and create all kinds of permutations in the timeline. That said, it all depends on when you look at it, because if that existed and that sort of thing transpired, then it always happened. Those of us who were affected by it just haven't experienced it yet. But there will be a point after that initial contact is made, the point after that first consciousness is sent back in time, where everyone affected experiences the second loop, and then the third loop, and then on the loops go. This is an interesting concept to me, especially when you get into the out-of-body experience information, especially the Monroe Institute information on this subject. The etheric body can leave and take your consciousness with it to experience what it experiences in the limited way that it can, in a different dimension than this physical dimension. And then as an extension of that, you have what are referred to as remote viewers, who are, for the most part, scammers like everyone else. But in theory, it is possible, based on that ability described by Monroe, to view future events. You take that one step further to your actual physical consciousness, if you can call your consciousness physical, in the way that it interacts with our sensory apparatus decoding system and this reality. You can't reach out and touch it, but it's physical in that sense. A part of your experience in the physical world, that is. If that consciousness could be sent back to a prior point in time, you could achieve unlimited power. Because you would have all of this information about what had transpired, and then you'd be able to invest in certain things early and make an unlimited amount of money and have an unlimited amount of power in that way. And if you extend that to the idea of this being some kind of reincarnation loop system that's going on, you could see how the intelligence that is in control here currently could have achieved the power and influence that it has if it is reincarnating over and over again with its memories intact. In that sense, the reincarnation is a form of time travel because they're cheating the system that's set up where everyone else has their memories wiped to extract their energy. But because they are a part of the ruling bloodlines that have been chosen by this entity that has constructed all of this to carry out its agenda, they incarnate with their memories intact of the prior lifetime. And so they have a huge advantage on everyone else as far as maintaining their power and system of control. So in that sense, it's very similar to the idea of how you might view time travel if it were to happen in the physical world. Again, is anything like that even possible? I don't know. They've shown it in certain science fiction settings. And as I've gone into in prior videos, we can actively time travel ourselves via our projections of the future that we use to dream and imagine. I mean, it is our imagination, right? Those are our projections of the future, what we view as possible. And then you have the very same feedback loop going in the other direction, which is all of your collective memories that are constantly looping in and out of your mind. And if you immerse yourself in a memory and really feel like you're there in that time and re-experience it, I mean, you can alter the effects that that memory had on your life up until that point. And in this way, you can heal trauma or transmute it in some way. And this is very similar to the idea that I just went into about physically time traveling back to a prior point in your life with the consciousness that you have now. Because obviously you would be doing a very similar thing in that way, trying to change something in your past that you know is going to happen that was detrimental in some way. The way it actually plays out in our minds is more a whatever happened kind of view of the timeline. There's no way to alter it. If it happened, it always happened. And this is a way to transmute trauma in the past. And then likewise, this is a way to transmute imaginations of the future that don't have your best interests in mind. And there's a lot of that going on right now with the way that media is promoting certain narratives that inform our collective view of what the future will be, most likely. The way it's presented by all media is that it is a foregone conclusion that this is where we are headed. This is what the future will be. And even those of us who are trying to make people aware of what their plans are playing into that in that way, helping to manifest it in that way. It's fascinating though, right? We're time traveling all the time. And I started thinking of this in a different way too, as I've been on this immersion in technology theme that I've been getting into lately. And what the effects of that will most likely be if it continues unabated. How the agenda is being shaped in that way. And I was thinking that posting a video on YouTube or composing a post on a social media website, a forum, even though forums have kind of died at this point, unfortunately. If you view it from a time travel lens, or just thinking about it in terms of a timeline in that way, that is linear, in theory, say when I upload this recording to YouTube, if we assume that the digital infrastructure of the internet and all of the servers and the electricity that runs those servers is still in existence, then this recording that I upload to YouTube is instantaneously viewable by someone 75 years or 100 years in the future. And it's kind of like a torrent. It would depend on how many people save it. Because if it's just a recording or a video that gets uploaded to YouTube and no one bothers to download it, maybe it's a little more frivolous along those lines. Say what most people use YouTube or TikTok to watch, which would be an animal video of some type. And I'm not pretending like I'm above that. Sometimes I just watch videos of dogs doing funny things because dogs are awesome. And it lightens my mood. But nobody is really downloading those videos to save, I would assume. I mean, there's probably somebody out there that has the world's largest animal video library. What do I know, right? That could be possible. But for the purposes of what we're discussing, I mean something that is likely to be memory hold if it is not preserved in this way. So it's like a torrent. If it is saved in enough places on enough hard drives, it doesn't matter how tyrannical the censorship gets, it can never be taken off the record in that way. It's a part of the digital record as long as there is electricity and a device that can play it back. Obviously, you run into scenarios where maybe somebody would have thought the same thing about a VCR recording that they had, and then you would run into the problem where you have something saved on a VCR tape, but there's nowhere to play it, and maybe an external hard drive that I have right now will eventually be phased out of existence, kind of in the way that they've intentionally phased the headphone jack out of existence to force people to use these Bluetooth, wireless headphones and other devices that have a detrimental impact on our biological rhythms and functions. And bigger than that is continuing the subconscious priming to condition the mind to accept technology eventually moving into the body. You take away the cord slowly over time to make the idea of you yourself being wirelessly connected to the internet more palatable, more plausible. Most people look at that and see it as an efficiency, as something good. Oh, I don't have to deal with this wire anymore, but they're not asking the bigger question about why they did that. Why can I no longer buy a device with a headphone jack? Please, someone explain this to me. I don't want to use these wireless devices. Anyways, assuming all of that, this recording, as soon as it is uploaded, will be viewable by someone in the future. And in that way, it is communicating with the future. It's time travel into the future. Now, if you view this from a conventional time travel perspective where time is not linear, the communication is instantaneous. I upload the video and it is instantaneously visible by anyone who has access to the same network in the future. Viewing it in that non-linear way, someone is listening to this 50 years from now at the same time that you are listening to it in this very moment, whenever that is. It's the same idea as it would be if I went outside and I buried a time capsule. I put a bunch of stuff in a box, buried it in the ground, and left instructions with someone to dig it up in 50 years. Well, as soon as I put it in the ground, theoretically, it's been dug up and looked at by those people 50 years into the future. But even viewing it in a traditional linear sense, I get this idea of digital archeology that could be going on in the future, where hackers have to actually search out new information that's been hidden deep in servers somewhere and memory hold in a way that no one can see it, because this is what these type of entities in control would do in a dystopian environment that they are in the process of building now. It would be the equivalent of what people used to do in the 20th century, and still do now, but even more so back then, going out and searching for stuff that had been buried and hidden that might have belonged to an ancient civilization that was far more advanced than we could have possibly imagined. But all of that evidence has been obscured in the same way that the digital evidence will be obscured in the future. By putting this stuff into the record, you're allowing for digital archaeology in the future. Now, in a way, I'm kind of forcing the time travel metaphor here in the sense of, well, if there was some type of consciousness time travel physically possible, in theory, based on what I just went over, you could communicate directly with the future, and those time travelers would be able to adjust their plans based on what you were communicating to them. And I don't mean to imply that that is what I actually think is going on, so I wanted to state that clearly just in case you were thinking that. Really what I'm doing here is using that as a metaphor to expand your mind about the possibilities that exist regarding what you're actually putting into the digital record. Stimulating the mind to think about things in a different way. Thinking non-linearly. Which I find to be a useful exercise because so much of our thinking is linearly based. To get a better idea of what I mean, this happens all the time now, where I'll be searching around, looking up a topic, or maybe just randomly scrolling news to see what's going on. And I'll come across somebody who has saved something along these lines. They saved a story, they saved a link to a story somewhere, or they saved a video somewhere, and they'll make a post that explains something to me that had been memory hold that I had never even heard happened. And then it's a cascade of dots that are connected for me, or it unlocks this new understanding of what's going on that I otherwise never would have had. And this is what I mean by communicating with the future with something that you upload now. 200 years from now, information could be saved in this way and later presented to someone that unlocks a piece to the puzzle that we can't even imagine in our current situation right now, because we just don't have the information that they have. Additionally, we don't have the information that is inside the mind of God that is coordinating all of this, and it might be coordinated in a certain way where it all leads to this one point with this group of individuals that has something unlocked for them with information that has been saved and transmitted in this way through periods where you couldn't even openly discuss it. The same thing is happening now. I'll give you an example. Just a couple weeks ago, I was doing the process that I described online, and I came across a link to someone who was explaining how in 2001, a month after 9/11, there was an attempted bombing of the Mexican parliament that has been completely wiped from the record. No one even discusses this anymore. I was completely unaware of this until I looked into it further, and it's like, oh wow, there's a couple stories that are still in existence on the Wayback Machine from actual Mexican newspapers on this, but otherwise it's been completely wiped from the record. And I had no idea that these two individuals somehow got into Mexican parliament and had explosives and fake Pakistani passports. Remember, this is a month after 9/11, and they had weapons, and it was obvious that they were about to create some type of false flag that was going to transpire in Mexico to try to force them into the war on terror, because up until this point they were very reluctant to get involved in spite of the worldwide pressure for them to do so. And it's been 20 years since that happened, and yet here I am just now hearing about it for the first time, only because people had saved the information for all those 20 years and kept it alive in various places where they could, because it's completely blacklisted news everywhere else. And I don't want to enable laziness, so I'm not going to describe the whole story here. I'm going to force you to look this up. But at the same time, I will provide some motivation for you to do so by describing the most important part of this story, which is that inexplicably, these two individuals who were foreigners somehow snuck in to Mexico's Capitol building, the equivalent of that, with fake passports and explosives, and yet somehow they were not detained in any way. They were never charged with any type of crime, and they were quickly deported out of the country. And then, like I said, the story was memory hold. So anyways, this is kind of a fun metaphorical way that I view putting information, especially the recorded voice, into the internet and its digital record. Like it's time travel, like I'm communicating with the future in butterfly effect ways that I can't even possibly imagine. That is one thing that the digital technology has unlocked, is this pipeline to the future, a way to send information 200 years into the future. Like I said, a new form of digital archeology that might take place in the future if things unfold in the way that they are designed to unfold by the intelligence that is currently in control of this reality. In that scenario in particular, it's even more important for those of us who remember what life was like before technology to get that experience into the digital record so that it can be referenced by the future. Keeping in mind that this could potentially turn into a future where human beings have become completely disconnected from nature and wouldn't even know what that was like, other than being able to reference recordings from people who were explaining it in a way that it could be felt through their voice, that they had something, some connection that was missing from the lives of those who were listening to it in the future. It's a form of time travel. It's a form of communicating with the future, sending your consciousness and your understanding of what is going on based on all of the evidence that you have in the current moment into the future. That someone with more context and a different perspective might be able to piece together in a way that you can't even imagine. And in this way, it could unlock so many different scenarios that you also can't even imagine. We all like to think that it will be our generation that sees the resolution of everything that has led up until this point, but many different generations that came before us were waiting for the same thing to happen, and life continued on its current trajectory well after those generations passed on. So I think it is healthy to consider that the same thing will happen, no matter what it seems like, based on all the news and agendas that are coming out in the open right now. Speaking of time, we don't have the perception of time in different scales of existence to reference in the same way, as I've said before in many different recordings, that a colony of ants doesn't have the same perception of time that we do in our dimension. 1,000 years for it could be 10 days for us. And likewise, 1,000 years for us could be 10 days to a different scale of intelligence beyond us that would be closer to the highest scale, which is the mind of God. And from that highest time scale, digital technology like I went into in the Long Con recording, could be a part of its plan. It could be a Trojan horse that it is using to eventually dismantle whatever is in control here. If we assume, going back to the last recording on eating meat, that this reality has been infected, for lack of a better term, by an intelligence that is doing what it does to human beings unjustifiably, in a way that it needs to be fixed, versus the possibility that this reality is some type of purgatory realm where everybody who is here with the blessing of the mind of God because we have done something to justify our placement here and justify everything that is going on around us, even though we sit here and we say, oh, this should not be happening. Or, of course, it could be some combination of the two, some variation that I'm not even thinking of right now or going into. A time loop could be sort of metaphorical to what's going on here. If you view it on a cosmic scale, in the way that, say, the Nile River floods at a certain point in time every year. Well, based on that yearly flooding, the entire civilization of Egypt sprung up and coordinated itself. It was all based on that one event, the flooding of the Nile every year. And if you view that cosmically, perhaps there is the equivalent of that, the flooding of the Nile happening on a cosmic level, and in that way it is sort of a time loop where the intelligence in control here builds civilization up, and then it is brought down by the flooding of the Nile, as it were, energetically, cosmically, and then it builds it back up. And we have collective amnesia about this cycle in the same way that we have collective amnesia about our past lives if we have been stuck in this reincarnation cycle without our knowledge as well. And again, there are many ways you can view that too, where some people would say, well, that's negative, like the Gnostic view of it. Oh, hey, that's a reincarnation soul trap. But then the Buddhists would say, well, yes, this is the state of reality that we're all subject to, but that's the whole point of it, is for you to transcend all of these cycles and achieve nirvana. Eventually transcend it, move beyond it. And that's something that everyone has to do over many generations. But I hope you can see how the Buddhist philosophy would be an alibi for a reincarnation soul trap for billions of people on the planet who adhere to that belief system. They would sit there and they would say, oh yeah, this explains that, and I'm cool with that because eventually I will reach this state where I transcend it. But from the opposite side of the spectrum, if it is a reincarnation soul trap, they're just breaking your will slowly over time until you eventually give yourself away to it. And that would be viewed as nirvana, as transcending it, if you viewed it from a human perspective while incarnated here. And if that scenario is the reality of the situation that we are in, those bloodlines that are in service to the intelligence that constructed all this continue to reincarnate in the underground bases for as long as they need to stay down there until it is safe for them to come up to the surface again and start all over. Rebooting civilization, as it were, and starting the process of building it back up again. In the same way, like I said, via metaphor, that the Nile River would flood every year. If your consciousness was inside of an ant colony that was on the bank of the Nile River, all you would know is that in your morphic memory, in the history of your genetic memory, your civilization is destroyed. And again, to your consciousness on that scale, that could be 1,000 years in between that event. But still, you have the memory of it. You know it's coming at some point. But the actual infrastructure of the civilization that was Egypt, of course, was built up knowing that the Nile floods every year. And so they had things placed in a way that life would continue on. And obviously in this scenario, human beings would metaphorically be the ants in the colony on the banks of the Nile who don't know that the flood is coming. In any event, if this was the situation, you could look at it like it is a time loop, because the same cycle is playing out over and over again. And after a while of doing it, rebuilding civilization, you would start to notice patterns to the point where you would be able to predict the future, and in that way it would be like history repeating itself. But it's interesting, right? Speaking of digital archaeology and time capsules, it's fascinating to wonder, were the Georgia Guidestones a message to this current generation of the bloodline families that work for this intelligence, or was it a message to future generations sometime in the distant future to remind them of how the best design would be? Very interesting. But remember, what I just described is just one possibility in a wide range of possibilities. Ultimately, I don't know what the truth is, and how could I know, given the fact that my mind just is not capable of seeing extended reality in the way that it actually is, because that scale of perception is just fundamentally different from my scale of perception. So I can put the pieces together in a certain range of outcomes. I have all these different possibilities, and then I can look at circumstantial evidence and sort of rate those possibilities on a percentage basis. Say this is, like, say there's a 10% chance I think that it's this, and a 20% chance that it's that, and then maybe an over 50% chance that it's this. And you kind of adjust that scale as you acquire more information, as your intuition gives you a different insight. It's a constantly adjusting scale. Or at least that's how I approach figuring out what's going on here. I have the humility to know that I don't have the answer, so I place it in that context of a range of outcomes. And I guess that's why I'm even getting into this, is that ultimate realization of, well, there's so much going on. There's so much information. There are so many possibilities that faith is the only answer. No matter what the truth of our predicament is, faith in that which created us to have our back and help us if we are open to it, and allow it to help us in that way, is the only answer there is.